Okay, so yeah, I'll go through the first couple of chapters in Frankenstein and try to give you a little idea of what we went through on Wednesday. Okay, and you should have your copy of Frankenstein with you as I go through this. And the big thing is in the letters, what they do is they set up the narrative within a narrative. Okay, and so you have the ship captain who comes across Victor Frankenstein. You have that really odd discussion of where he asks, which way are you going before I agree to get on the boat. And he's about to freeze to death, but he wants to make darn sure. So that's really odd, but Victor Frankenstein gets on the boat and then starts recounting his narrative. And so it's one narrative inside of another, And let's jump in and so just start going through it. I'll go through it kind of quickly, but I think I'll give you a good idea of some of the themes that are going on. One thing I do want to mention is that the notes throughout the book, throughout the copy that I've distributed to you guys, are excellent. But I do want to point out that some of it I don't agree with, but I really want to emphasize it's really good. So I'll see if I can point out some disagreements, but overall, the notes are very good. The notes do, however, make the text of the book a lot longer. Originally, Frankenstein is about 150 pages or something like that. That's pretty short. With the notes all thrown in there, it's about 300 pages. It's about half the text. So it's up to you if you want to read the notes. But it is something that this text reflects from if you remember Edward Gibbon, when he went bonkers with all the footnotes, and we had them in the side in the text that I had. But it's documenting stuff, and that is a development that came out of out of Francis Bacon, and then it was adopted. The whole idea of reliability was adopted in history. But I'll shut up and shrink myself up. Okay, let's see here. So this is chapter 1. I didn't have anything. Victor's from Geneva. I don't know what to say about that. It's Switzerland. Okay, and on the second, and I forget what page this is. He sets up their adoption of Elizabeth here, or sort of, kind of. It sets up the theme of helping people out, okay, which comes up again and again and again, okay, and I'll come back to this a few times here. His daughter attended him with the greatest tenderness, but she saw with despair that their little fund was rapidly decreasing, and then there was no other prospect of support. And this is where the father kind of steps in and ends up getting married with the daughter and everything. But one of the themes that goes on, I don't know, much more to say about that. The Beaufort and other stuff is, it brings in a theme of helping people out incessantly. But it comes up again and again. I'll come back to it in a bit. My father did not hesitate and immediately went to Italy, that he might accompany the little Elizabeth to their future home. This is him taking in Elizabeth. That's his niece. And that's Victor Frankenstein's cousin. Now, it gets a little bit, it's one of those, using the family reunion as a nice place to pick people up. It's a bad idea. But it comes up in here, and it's important to keep in mind that people often married their first cousins in this time period. And I did mention in class that Charles Darwin, of all people, married his first cousin. Okay, that was his wife in the end. So Elizabeth is his first cousin, and so that was not, it would strike us today as being a kind of a creepy arrangement, and it was, but it wasn't that uncommon. And by the way, in our genetics, it shows that humankind has been doing this for a very, very, very long time. Okay, it's a fairly recent development that people don't marry within the family, within the cousins and all that. But enough of the creepiness. But this brings in Elizabeth, okay, to the future home. I have often heard my mother say that she was at the time the most beautiful child she had ever seen, and showed signs, and by the way, that is how they spelled showed, signs even then of a gentle and affectionate disposition. So the mother thinks she's a magnificent person and everything else, and she's beautiful. Yeah, we won't go too far with that right now. From this time, Elizabeth Lavenza became my playfellow, and as we grew older, my friend. She was docile and good-tempered, yet gay and playful as a summer insect. Although she was lively and animated, her feelings were strong and deep, and her disposition uncommonly affectionate. No one could better enjoy liberty. No one could submit with more grace than she to the constraints and caprice. This is, obviously is overflowing with praise for Elizabeth. She's just a wonderful young woman. But let's jump up to the next page. He brings in, and I'll just touch on this and then run away, Henry Cheval, or Clerval, was the son of a merchant in Geneva, an intimate friend of my father. I'll just bring him in. He does become kind of important as the story goes on. No youth could have passed, and this is something he really hammers away at this page or two. No youth could have passed more happily than mine. My parents were both were indulgent, and my companions amiable. Our studies were never forced, and by some means we always had an end placed in view. In other words, they knew what they were doing, which excited us to ardor in the prosecution of them. It was by this method, and not by emulation, that we were urged to application. So they essentially treated their studies as a time to explore new knowledge. But now, mind you, it's not really disciplined. It's not directed that well. And so it's a process of self-discovery. That's what he describes here. And he does get pretty far afield into some weird things. And this is natural philosophy. This would have been essentially all the life sciences. They didn't have the term biology. And something to understand, they didn't have a lot of fields. Economics as a field was not established. So Adam Smith had only just written Wealth of Nations about 35 years before this. Economics was only just finding its footing at this time. And Adam Smith was not an economist. He was a philosopher. He was a moral philosopher. So many fields were just beginning. What you guys saw in Francis Bacon was the beginning of all these fields of study that were establishing themselves throughout the university systems. So this is at the early stages of the university system establishing itself. But I do want to point this out with natural philosophy. The footnote is excellent, and this one is just right on the mark. Natural philosophy and natural philosopher were broadly encompassing terms for the theoretical and empirical inquiry. Theoretical means trying to figure out what can we use to explain this, and the empirical is just recording what's going on. Okay. So into the natural world, and those who conducted each inquiries. The latter were used prior to the rise of the term scientist. So scientist is only just starting to be used. It hasn't really been used much, but it does exist. So, but no matter. The footnotes are very good. They give kind of a context that we are lacking today that existed at the time. Mary Shelley, I gotta say, was shockingly clued in on things. Even though she wrote this in her late teens, she kind of came up with the idea around 17. She wrote it in her teens, I think over the next year or two. She was incredibly well read. Cornelius Agrippa. So he was a guy, I looked him up for the class. You can look him up. He's a German scientist, but he is the first one who was along with Albert Magnus and others, who mixes, which was the practice at the time, mixing things like alchemy, religion, and science, what would become known as a scientific inquiry, mixing them together. Okay, and the father says, Cornelius Agrippa, my dear Victor, do not waste your time on this. It's sad trash. Now, we wouldn't look to it today as being a reliable source for scientific inquiry. But I really want to emphasize, in the centuries before Mary Shelley had started writing this, that was common practice, to mix things, such as alchemy. That's the ability to turn base metals, such as lead or other things, into gold. That was a belief they could do. And by the way, they did figure it out in the 1950s, but no matter. Everybody thought they can do it. And it's not just Agrippa. It's people like Isaac Newton was involved in that. The vast majority of Isaac Newton's writings were religious, not scientific. He's known for Principia Naturae, the principles of nature, which explains, how things like gravity and other things. He thought gravity was a force. Gravity, by the way, we understand it today as the warping of space-time. It's not a force. It's the warping of space-time. But no matter. What Isaac Newton accomplished was shocking. It's just phenomenal what he accomplished with the Principia Naturae. Okay, but it's very important to understand what science was. It was mixed, and with these other fields, with religious studies and other things, and it wasn't as a disciplined approach to religious studies. It would be more mysticism than anything else. They were mixed together in alchemy and all this other stuff, but also magic, especially in the figure of Albert Magnus. These fields were all mixed together. There was no clear delineation of them. By Mary Shelley's time, they were just starting to be delineated. They were undertaking something brand new. Okay, so I hope that's kind of clear, which is why things will seem a little bit odd. If instead of this remark my father had taken the pains to explain to me the principles of Agrippa had been entirely exploded, and that a modern system of science had been introduced, which possessed much greater powers than the ancient, because the powers of the latter world are chimerical. In other words, they're going to come in and they're not going to last. Chimerical, while those of the former were real and practical. Under the circumstances, I should have certainly thrown Agrippa aside, and with my imagination warmed as it was, should probably have applied myself to more rational theories of chemistry. Chemistry was at this time a brand new field, and he does mention it here as being one of the most promising areas of science, and it was. They had not come up with the periodical table of elements. They would in about 50 years or so. Some guy in Russia came up with the initial periodical table of elements, but chemistry was where the most promise seemed to lie. But it's a dismissal of Agrippa by his father. It's not. He doesn't seem to really get Agrippa any better than anybody else. And so the mixing of science, magic, and all these other fields was a lot more alive and well in Agrippa. The father does not seem to be able to make a clear distinction among them. This is a great note on alchemy, which again was taken very seriously as a field. Okay, and again, Isaac Newton wrote about it and engaged in it himself, and had a strong connection with medicine. Yeah, it did. Medicine and other things were all pretty dang goofy. Okay. He mentions Albert Magnus, and I did mention him in class as being a figure who very famously mixed what little scientific knowledge he had with magic. He was a religious figure, though. He was a priest in the Catholic Church, and he would mix together religion, science, magic, what we would call those. He saw them all as part of his studies. But again, one of the founding fathers of what we recognize today as biology. Let's jump up. When I was about 15 years old, we had retired our house near Bellerive when we witnessed the most violent and terrible thunderstorm. And that was the presence of, and that's going to be one of the experiences that obviously we won't get to it yet, is going to lead to the creation of the monster, whom we're going to see in a bit. Not too long. But this is using some of his early experiences to essentially create the monster. But let's jump up. But he lays the seeds of what's going to come up early on. Okay, the catastrophe of the tree excited my extreme excitement. This is, he checked out the lightning, and I eagerly inquired of my father the nature and origin of thunder and lightning. He replied, electricity. Okay, the father is very vaguely familiar with science, and folks like Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin, even though he actually was a figure in early electricity discovery and development, his father is very vaguely aware of the science on it, not adequately. These guys, he says he's going to ditch them, but he doesn't really ditch them, not entirely. Okay, so he gets sent off to school. This is chapter 2. Let me try to go fast here. When I had attained the age of 17, my parents resolved that I should be sent as a student at Ingolstadt. Okay, he's going to go off to school. Now, this is where he's going to get a more disciplined education. So, and that seems like a good idea. It says Elizabeth had caught the scarlet fever, and this happens right when he's about to go off. And this is that theme. I'll run through this kind of rapidly. I won't read the whole thing. Elizabeth gets the scarlet fever, and they isolate her. They know that they didn't quite get germ theory, but they knew when somebody got horrifically sick, you better keep your distance, or else you're going to get sick too. Okay, they didn't fully get germ theory, but they knew, be careful if people get sick. Elizabeth gets sick. The mother refrains from taking care of her, and again, that need to help others comes up again and again. And to compensate, and the mother comes down with scarlet fever, she relents, goes in, helps take care of Elizabeth, and she gets scarlet fever and she dies. Elizabeth lives. Now, one of the things I do want to mention, let me pop myself up, is that Shelley here, Mary Shelley, her mother died within a month of her birth. I usually don't make much of biographical details, but Mary Shelley would have been very acutely aware of how her birth led to the death of her mother, and would have dealt with overwhelming feelings of grief, even though she has absolutely no personal responsibility in any real sense for the death of her mother. The notes mention evil, that this is the presence of evil. I don't really agree with that assessment. I would call this, just the presence of the indifference of the universe to what goes on with us. I would, deal with more conscious acts as being the presence of evil. And one of the things I mentioned in class is that John Milton's Paradise Lost has the figure of Satan in it. And Satan, it's very important to understand in the book of Revelations, was Lucifer, was this light. Lucifer means light, and was actually elevated above Jesus. And then he has a moment in John Milton's poem where he does the non serviam, which is a Latin phrase I encourage you to learn, because it shows up in Milton as being the absolute key to the fall. It is not a violent act or a terrible act in any kind of real physical sense. It's a mental act by Lucifer stating, I will not serve. That's the nature of the rebellion from God, and the nature of sin and everything else is the I will not serve. Okay. All right, so I see it as different. They see, the death of the mother here as being the presence of evil. It's just a difference. Okay, let me get a couple more points and then I'll shut up in 20 minutes. Since the death of her aunt, her mind had acquired, this is with Elizabeth, acquired a new firmness and vigor. She determined to fulfill her duties with the greatest exactness, and she felt that the most imperious duty of rendering her uncle and cousins happy had devolved upon her. This is that need to compensate for guilt and do what she can do to try to make up for this. This theme of compensating with kindness and out of a sense of obligation comes up over and over and over again throughout the text. Okay, and are you responsible for these others? And let me get one more here. The next morning, I delivered my letters of introduction. Let me try to cover these professors really fast. He brings up M. Krempe, a professor of natural philosophy. And he says, this was a passage we did in class. Have you, he said, really spent your time in studying this nonsense? Okay. And he is absolutely contemptuous, worse than his father was. Okay. And he is very contemptuous. And he says, every minute, continued M. Krempe with warmth, every instance that you have wasted on those books is utterly and entirely lost. You have burdened your memory with exploded systems and useless names. And then he has this last line here, and I want you, this is where literature and your skills as a, as an English major come in. And so notice Krimpe's absolute dismissal of the readings that Victor had engaged in. And I don't want to defend the writers at all, but I do want to state that I think that Shelley is not very sympathetic with Krimpe, is not exactly sympathetic with Magnus and others, but the reaction here is troubling. I little expected this enlightened scientific age to find a disciple of Albert Magnus and Paracelsus. These, again, are people in science who mixed together religion, magic, alchemy, and all these fields. They saw it as the same endeavor. Okay, my dear sir, you must begin your studies entirely anew. Notice the nature of the language. Okay, it's a turning over everything from before and bringing something entirely new. It's in a very real way, Krimpe sees the scientific endeavor as almost a religious pursuit. The term I brought up in class was enthusiasm. Be very careful when you detect enthusiasm in any character in Frankenstein. It's always a little bit troubling, okay? The enthusiasm of Krimpe is much like the enthusiasm that we saw from Frankenstein when he jumped into the field, okay? And he tries to take Frankenstein in as much of a disciple as everybody else did. So it's much of the mechanisms of, that we saw, in the Bible with Jesus and his disciples. It's much of the same mechanism, and I don't think that's me projecting it onto Shelley. I think it's there, okay? It does, I'm a little bit troubled by this footnote on 28 to illustrate the problem with self-learning. I don't think Shelley's entirely against it. I think it's supposed to be a little bit of a busy process myself, no matter. So saying, he stepped aside and wrote down, he puts together a new list, and he goes home, and he's not entirely enthusiastic about it. He's being made into a new disciple. And so I liked this footnote. I thought this was magnificent. And again, notice his lack of enthusiasm for the very enthusiastic Krimpe. Many scholars argue that science and technology, especially as practiced in the West, have always been about achieving immortality and power. I really like that. I'll drop that right there. I'll leave that alone, but I think that's a magnificent point. Okay, you see a lot of that in Frankenstein. Let me do this one really fast. He goes to Waldman, and Waldman goes through and really he gets more, he takes more of a, and I'll do this kind of fast because I got to shut up. Okay, Waldman is a little more open-minded, a little more, so, but not that much. He does give him more of an approach where he can explore more. He's not turning Frankenstein into an absolute disciple who must follow the rules. He does open up this promise of that we're going to go after something very important, but we have to be very modest. But I really want to emphasize something that you get from science is something that you should recall from Francis Bacon, is the modesty, the conservatism in the sense that you don't overstate your case. You stick with what you can observe, what you can observe with reliability. Although Bacon doesn't use the term reliability, I do, but that's there in Bacon. I don't think I'm pushing it very far. You see that with Waldman is a little bit better, and he gets hooked up with Waldman a little bit more enthusiastically, and he starts to question, the text he had before. Okay, keep an eye on these themes as how he starts to define himself as a young scientist. It's going to go forward from there, but also the themes of the enthusiasm, be careful with. Don't either dismiss or embrace moments of enthusiasm. So don't get enthusiastic about enthusiasm. Okay, it's never entirely clear. Notice the way people feel sympathy and want to sacrifice themselves for others. Okay, that's always a little bit sketchy. Okay, whom they feel obligated to. So I'll leave it there. Have some more fun with this. We will start, I think, on 3 and 4. We may have gotten through 3. I kind of forget. Let's see. But we'll pick it up. Try to read, if you can, up to around page 100. All right, take care, sir.